Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm Christina DeArmond. I do trade marketing for the Oregon Wine Board. Today I'm going to start off with a quick introduction to Oregon Wine Month, and then Bree Boskov is going to take over. She's an MW and our education manager at Oregon Wine Board. She's going to do the Oregon Wine Masterclass, talking about an industry overview. She'll be going over an introduction to the geography, soil, and climates of Oregon's 18 AVAs, the labeling regulations throughout the state, and industry statistics. And then we'll wrap up at the end with question and answer. So one of the reasons we're doing this webinar today is to kick off Oregon Wine Month. Oregon Wine Month starts off in May, and it's a celebration of all things Oregon wine across the state of Oregon and the country. We have 38 distributors who are doing Oregon Wine Month we have over 70 distributors doing Oregon Wine Month in 38 states across the country, so really exciting. If you haven't heard of Oregon Wine Month, we are offering a lot of resources for distributors, retailers, and restaurants to get involved. The best way to get started and to learn what we have to offer is by visiting the Oregon Wine Month Toolkit. So I'm going to hop off real quick and show you the resources available on our toolkit and ways to get started. So the toolkit is on our industry.oregonwine.org website, and you can navigate there by going to Oregon Wine Month. Here you can find everything you need from point of sale, so you can flip through here and look at everything that we have available. If you're a distributor, you should have received the POS last week or this week, so talk to your managers and look in your warehouse. It should be there. If you're a restaurant or retailer, talk to your distributors about how you can get POS delivered to your account. If you have any questions, if you're out of Oregon and you have questions about what distributors are participating in Oregon Wine Month in your market and have POS, please shoot me an email at christina.oregonwine.org, and also be following up with an email, so you'll have that. But I'll be able to tell you which distributors you can get Oregon Wine Month POS from. We have downloadable POS as well if you want to make your own graphics. We have this great one sheet about how restaurants can get involved in Oregon Wine Month, so you can read through that and download it. If restaurants would like to sign up, you can do that here. If you're doing an Oregon Wine Month wine dinner or any kind of event, we can promote it on our calendar. And there's many other resources, including social media, graphics, and all that kind of stuff. So that's all available on Oregon Wine Month, on the Oregon Wine Month Toolkit here. So let's get started with the masterclass. I'm going to introduce you to Bree Boskov, and she's going to take the floor.
Thanks, Christina, and thank you for organizing this webinar. So we are going to cover the entire state of Oregon today and its growing regions, and this is a basic introduction class to Oregon, and in the future we may release a deeper dive webinar and also conduct master classes throughout this US as well going forward. So just to set the scene a little, where in the world is Oregon? We are in the Pacific Northwest. We buffer up against the cool Pacific Ocean. We're located right around the 45th parallel, which is coming up towards the uppermost limit of grape growing, and we are considered a marginal climate for grape growing, as our harvest season is very vintage variable, depending on those storms and weather systems that come through the Pacific. So unlike Burgundy and much of Europe's wine regions that sit on a continental, on the 45th parallel, they sit in a continental range and so have a very different growing season to what Oregon producers encounter. So we are bordered to the north by Washington and to the south by California, the U.S.'s two largest grape-producing states. The West Coast growing regions span more than 1,200 miles from north to south. So the geographical landmarks of Oregon, all of these aspects are key influences of the growing regions that our producers farm in. So Oregon is a state that is bound by the cool maritime influence and heavily influenced by the river systems that have been created through the mountain ranges that have formed over the volcanic and ice age periods that formed our state. The Pacific Ocean, the influence of the rivers, and the mountain ranges are the major aspects and all affect Oregon's ability to be able to grow grapes during our warm summer seasons. So we really need those cool ocean influences, the airflow that's provided by the aspect of slope and the flow of the rivers through our areas to cool our warm summers and provide us with a moderate climate that allows us not to freeze in the winter, which is what Washington and the eastern part of Oregon often comes up against in terms of extending their viticultural season and the quality of their vines. Another major factor, which we'll talk about later, is that being on the 45th parallel, we also have an extended amount of daylight hours, often up to 15 hours during the day in summer, which is important to the full ripening of a variety of grape varieties.
It looks like some of the slide is being cut off in the view. So we will make sure to send this deck to you afterwards and you can see the full slide. I'm not sure why it's doing that. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Christina. So we have 18 AVAs with half a dozen or more that have been accepted by the TTB and are currently awaiting final approval. The majority of these AVAs are nested AVAs within the large Willamette Valley. So we like to think of our state as broken down into really 5 major growing regions. The eastern region, which covers Walla Walla Valley and Idaho, the Columbia Gorge in the north along the Columbia River, and the Willamette Valley, specifically the northern Willamette Valley, and then moving into southern Oregon, where we segment into the Umpqua Valley and the Rogue Valley. The first major plantings in Oregon were in the Willamette Valley. However, the very first plantings were in the southern Oregon appellation prior to Prohibition, which was mainly Pais and local California Spanish Mission varieties. So if you take a look at our state, our vineyards are concentrated in the northern Willamette Valley, and the other growing regions are continuing to gain prominence. According to the TTB, Oregon wine brands are expanding at an average of 4 per month. The Willamette Valley and Southern Oregon AVAs continue to see the most expansion of both brand and new vineyard plantings in our state. Again, plantings were here in the 1800s. However, they were focused around Pais and Mission varieties. Once Prohibition took hold of the industry, it completely floundered, and the second coming of the vine in Oregon began in the mid-1960s with Richard Somers, Charles Curry, and David Lett planting the first vines. Now Oregon wine is thriving at around 4 per month. You can see there we have more than 725 wineries and over 1,000 vineyards being farmed. In relation to California and Washington, that is a relatively small number, and this is what is incredibly unique about Oregon's wine industry and our wines and producers. We're different. We have a relatively small wine industry. Our state is third in the number of wineries and fourth largest in wine volume in the US. Our approach to viticulture, winemaking, and marketing tends to be more personal and handcrafted because of our size. Many vineyards are less than 20 acres, and this pioneering spirit really has worked in our benefit in terms of collaboration with each other and the sharing of knowledge within our small regions. So we produce 1% of the fine wine in the US, and 70% of Oregon wineries produce fewer than 5,000 cases per year. This is another fact that makes Oregon wine unique. We have very mountainous aspects that are reliant on river valleys and hillside vineyards. Because of that, we are generally hand farmed. We have very little machine harvesting, very hands-on in our vineyard, and our practices are really developed towards the environmental concerns and future generations that will farm our lands. So Oregon producers represent 35% of the US production of certified organic or biodynamic wine, despite producing only 1% of US production. This makes us pretty unique, and we're quite proud of this fact and think it's a special attribute. There is accountability to our environment and for the well-being of our neighbors and our lands. In addition, Oregon is not a homogenized grape growing region. Our grape growing regions are surrounded by other agriculture. In fact, the vine sits at around 6 in the number of agricultural pursuits that are important to Oregon. So we are surrounded by dairy farming, nuts and berry farms within the Willamette Valley, Southern Oregon and Eastern Oregon, and it continues to be a diverse agricultural environment, not a homogenized wine growing region. Oregon's top varieties, Pinot Noir is definitely king in Oregon, and we are quite unique in that, especially in the northern Willamette Valley, no other region in the world, in the New World, is as dedicated to a single grape variety as Oregon is. So that means that we have, over the past 50 years, developed an intimate understanding of how these vines will perform in our unique environment and how our producers can craft a distinctive wine from their sites. Pinot Noir accounts for 64% of plantings in all of Oregon, although there are 72 varieties that are grown, and this number is climbing swiftly with new plant material that's being brought into the country by UC Davis and FPS, other regions. So we're expanding into interesting and alternative varietals like Ribolla Gialla, Trousseau Noir, and even Mencia is planted in the Columbia River Gorge.
Bree, I'm going to get you set up here so that people can see the full slides. So hang on with us one sec, everybody. Okay, that's a little bit better.
Nope. So Oregon winemakers are unique also in that they've imposed some of the strictest labeling regulations on themselves in the United States. And this makes us very unique, and also is important consideration for our quality of production and our dedication and commitment to these varieties. So place of origin labeling regulations. For the federal TTB regulations, it's the standard 75% of grapes must be from the place named on the label. If you're within an American viticultural area, an AVA, 85% of your grapes must be from the AVA named. In Oregon, we've taken these a step further and have announced that 100% of the grapes must be from Oregon if Oregon is to be put on the label. Napa Valley has recently come through and confirmed their position on this also. We were some of the first to do it, which is a testament to the forward-thinking and high-quality minded views of our producers even all those years ago. In terms of the AVA area, we've committed to a further 10% in addition to other states in the U.S. So if there is a AVA named on the label, such as Dundee Hills or Applegate Valley, 95% of the grapes must be from that named AVA. In reality, for the majority of Oregon producers, given their size, this is actually 100%. Varietal declaration. This is where Oregon has really set the bar even higher for quality and pure varietal expression. In Oregon, at least 90% of the wine must be made from the variety named on the label. The federal regulation is 75%. So this is a distinctive character of Oregon wines, and the reason that the quality of Oregon wines is remaining so high and also is noticed by critics internationally and nationally for having integrity, purity of product, and quality of product. The 90% rule applies to most varieties in Oregon, primarily Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, and more than 50 other varieties that are grown. It does exclude 18 varieties, which are varieties that are typically blended into Rhone blends or Bordeaux blends. So the varietal declaration of the 18 varieties that are permitted for blending and can still be listed on the label. The next,
we did have one question that came in about variety. Someone said, did you say that Nero d'Avola is being planted in the Columbia Gorge?
I haven't heard of Nero d'Avola being planted in the Columbia Gorge as yet. I know that there's Mencia planted in the Columbia Gorge. There's Ribolla Gialla, Gadeo. There's a lot of Iberian varieties. I'm not sure that Nero d'Avola is in the U.S. at the moment, but it's considering that it's in Australia, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of varieties coming in that we haven't had access to yet. And I certainly wouldn't be surprised if it were in the Columbia Gorge. The winemakers in the Columbia Gorge tend to be very forward-thinking and creative in their planting and travels around the world and their curiosity about what grapes can grow in that environment.
Actually, Vanessa Haddock just chimed in from Sokolwasser. She said there is Nero d'Avola in Southern Oregon.
Oh, really?
So,
what about?
Now you know. I'm not sure exactly. Thanks for that, Vanessa. and please feel free to ask questions as we go.
So the other factors that are unique for creating Oregon's wine styles and what influences our varietal selection, our farming practices, and the style of wines that we produce. Our temperatures. You can generally divide Oregon's growing regions into 4 climate types: cool, intermediate, warm, and hot. We currently only occupy 3, with Columbia Gorge and the Willamette Valley sitting in the cool climate region, and then the intermediate is Southern Oregon, with Walla Walla being our warmest Appalachian or AVA area in the east, which has severe high temperatures in the growing season. This one?
No.
Oh. Technical difficulties. So what you're seeing here is a growing degree day map of California and Oregon. So you can see visually there the number of degree days in our growing regions across the annual climate data. So much warmer than the Napa Valley and even Sonoma County. You can see our coastal influences are strong, and we have a high desert climate in the interior, which contributes to large diurnal swings also. So our warm days during the growing season are generally tempered by a huge diurnal shift, and that is actually most noticeable in the southern Oregon AVA of the Umpqua Valley, which has some of the largest diurnal shifts in any wine region known. Often the shift is 40 to 50 degrees during the night. So this really helps to preserve the freshness in the grape variety. It cools them down after the heat of the day, preserving acidity, providing an extended growing season, and it allows thicker skin development and the development of complex flavors. However, as I mentioned earlier, any grape grower will tell you that it's really the end of the season that makes a vintage in Oregon, and the vintage variability in Oregon is really fierce. In 2011, to give you an example, the harvest was one of the coldest, wettest, and latest on record. And then 2012 was a long, even growing season that seemed to return to normal, and fruit could hang into a long golden harvest into late fall. 2013, we were hit with a typhoon at the end of September, and 2014, 15, and 16 seemed to be some of the best on record, with consistently warm, really hazard-free growing conditions. And then 2017, a return to more of a traditional Pacific Northwest cooler growing season, where harvest really didn't begin until the end of September and into October for our red varieties. And 2018 looks to be the same way. At the moment, we're still fairly cool and rainy outside, and bud break is around the corner, but definitely a couple of weeks ahead behind what 2017 was.
Going back to the slide before this, we had a question that came in. For context, where would some of Italy's regions fall on this temperature map?
So in terms of the Walla Walla or Southern Oregon, that would be more along the lines of Sicily and those areas, the Columbia Gorge and Willamette Valley. You're looking more at the alpine areas of Piemonte, Aosta, and Alto Adige in terms of continentality and cool climate areas. Obviously, the Columbia Gorge and the Willamette Valley are more influenced by Pacific Ocean air currents and weather patterns, whereas the alpine areas of Italy are more influenced by that continental climate and short growing season. Willamette Valley and Southern Oregon, again, would be bordering still that alpine area, and often into that classic area, intermediate classic area of Chianti and Bulgari for Southern Oregon in terms of grape varieties. Sunshine in Oregon, as I mentioned earlier, this is a large impact on the varieties that we can grow and the flavor development that we see in Oregon. So even though we're on the same parallel as Burgundy and some of the continental regions in Europe, we have an extended growing season by sunshine. So it's common knowledge among viticultural researchers that UV light is as important to ripening and flavor development as is heat summation. So Oregon's long daylight hours are key to ripening our fruit in this otherwise often marginal climate, depending on when our fall rains come. Because of all of these past three factors combined, the rainfall, the temperature, and the daylight hours, vintage variation is a unique part of the Oregon wine conversation, and really something that is still exciting about the wine, what we get excited about in the wine industry, discussions around vintage complexity, ageability of vintages, classic vintages, and where the region is heading with or without climate change. Main varieties, Pinot Noir, as I mentioned earlier, occupies 64% of the plantings. 72% of the plantings in the Willamette Valley are Pinot Noir. And as I mentioned earlier, because of this intensity of plantings of this single variety, more tends to be known about site and subzone or nested AVA microclimates than is typical for other New World regions that are planted to a multitude of grape varieties. No other New World region has such a commitment to a single variety. Pinot Gris, this is a widely grown variety, occupies, I think that's a little bit higher now, 14%, around 14 to 15% of Oregon's wine plantings. So Pinot Gris was actually one of the first varieties that were brought to the area. David Lett planted this variety in the 1960s, and no one had planted it in the U.S. commercially. So David Lett, even though he's known as Papa Pinot, is also Papa Pinot Gris as well. So definitely an Alsatian and Burgundian supporter, and he released the first Dundee Hills Pinot Gris in the U.S. in 1966. It was the first wine to carry the Pinot Gris label in the New World, and that was on Irie's 1970 vintage. Ponzi followed suit and released their first Pinot Gris in 1978, and it's really the white variety that Oregon became known for. Over the 1990s, Pinot Gris acreage overtook that of any other variety. The most significant increase in Oregon Pinot Gris production was when King Estate made the variety a significant part of their portfolio. Pinot Gris acreage in Oregon continues to grow. It increased 88% in the last 10 years, which is a testament to how many people are really moving to Oregon and noticing the quality of the wine and fruit produced here. Chardonnay, we are seeing an exciting resurgence in Chardonnay production, and while it's only 6% of the total of Oregon's wine grape plantings, in the Willamette Valley, the plantings of Chardonnay have really increased again to around 14%. So Pinot Gris tends to be plateauing in terms of there's not a whole lot of new plantings of Pinot Gris currently going into the ground, but Chardonnay is coming back with full force. So Chardonnay in Oregon was a once lamented style. It was really established when it was the big, buttery, opulently oaked Chardonnays and uber ripe Chardonnays of California that really were in favor in the 1980s. And Oregon's growing climate just couldn't achieve those ripeness levels and characters, especially with the older clonal selections that were available at the time. So the Draper selection, the Old Wente selection, and what we now refer to as the heritage clones of California. In today's changing climate, those clones are having some success again now, but it really wasn't until David Adelsheim went to Burgundy to research and bring in some Dijon clones from Burgundy, from the Ministry of Agriculture in Dijon. So those clones 76, 95, and 96 were imported into the region in 1988, and that was really when the bloom of Oregon Chardonnay plantings started to take off again. These Dijon clones ripened 2 to 3 weeks earlier with more flavor development than the original heritage clones that were planted here. And the combination of attentive vineyard practices and greater availability of clones has now led to this renaissance of Chardonnay from both older and newer plantings in Oregon and in the Willamette Valley specifically. There's also been a lot more attention paid to the site specificity of Chardonnay in Oregon now. So really seeking out the proper aspects of slope, the cooler areas where the grape variety can develop really lovely fruit expression and still maintain its very lean, austere style as compared to the more opulent styles being produced north and south of us. Sparkling wine in Oregon, I threw this one in because we are now seeing a lot of bubbles being produced in the state. We rank 4th among the U.S. states for sparkling production, really still quite small at this stage, less than 70,000 cases annually, which is some wineries in California, that's their production of one brand. So there are now close to 40 Oregon wineries that produce a sparkling wine. Traditionally, these are made from the traditional varieties of Pinot Noir, Chardonnay. Pinot Meunier plantings are increasing, but primarily it's Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, some Pinot Blanc also, and some Riesling. Experimentation is now happening with non-vintage blends, Blanc de Noir, Blanc de Blanc, and vintage styles all along the different AVAs, and even pet nat styles or method ancestral styles with alternative varieties like Vermentino and Grenache and more playful styles being made. So they're the main focuses of the varietal production in Oregon. We'll now start to dive into the individual AVAs, and we're going to run from north to south in terms of our AVA discussion. So we'll begin in the northeast with the Walla Walla Valley.
Before we get started with the AVAs, does anyone have any questions about just Oregon wine in general and the varieties we grow here, or anything about our history? No? Okay, maybe they'll come in later.
Okay, so the Walla Walla Valley, located in the far east, our high desert plateaus, located far from the marine influences of the Pacific Ocean. It is the state's warmest AVA and growing region. The important factor of Walla Walla in terms of climate is its large diurnal temperature shifts in the evenings and the intensity of its summer days. Summer days are often in the high 90s, early hundreds for extended periods of time. Irrigation is vital in the Walla Walla Valley. The free draining soils and cobbles, while they absorb the heat of the spring and allow these thicker skinned Bordeaux varieties and Rhone varieties to begin ripening early and have full ripening in this region, the free draining soils do not retain water, and there's not a lot of water available. The growing season is very dry, although it's relatively wind-free, so there's no real wind stress or dehydration because of wind in this area. If you travel into the microclimates, into the foothills of the Blue Mountains, it allows for many different aspects, and you can plant various Bordeaux and Rhone varieties, including the white varieties of Sauvignon Blanc and Viognier that perform very well in this climate as well. There is some experimentation with Iberian varieties as these have become more available in the state, so more attention being paid to Garnacha or Grenache, Tempranillo, and Touriga Nacional, other varieties, and even Albarino up in this bordered area. This Walla Walla Valley area does share a regional name with Washington to the north. Many of the vineyards are planted on the Oregon side, but due to federal labeling regulations, a lot of the wines that are grown on the Oregon side will actually be labeled from Washington wineries. So vineyard plantings in Walla Walla. Walla Walla accounts for about 4% of Oregon's land that's planted to vineyards. Cabernet Sauvignon dominates, followed by other Bordeaux varieties, Merlot at 18%, Syrah 17%, and then the blending partners, Cabernet Franc, Malbec, and Petit Verdot, combined to make up the other red grape varieties of prominence in the Walla Walla Valley. These wines are generally traditionally Bordeaux and Napa style fermentations, temperature controlled, moderate extractions. The thick skins here mean, because of the diurnal temperature shift and the heat of the days, mean that you need to be gentle with your extraction, and so pump overs are common, as well as long temperature controlled fermentations. Barrel aging is also important, often in a combination of American and French oak barrels, but primarily French for many of the reserve or estate bottlings, and in that very much Napa Valley style, but with a lot more earthiness and acidity and more tension on the palate than some of the southern styles. Temperature and precipitation in the Walla Walla Valley. As I mentioned, this area is quite unique and unlike any of the other wine-growing regions to the west of the Cascade Mountains. Walla Walla has a severely continental climate. This is high desert country, and this desert valley actually runs straight north through Washington and up into BC in Canada. So very, very cool, cold winters, and vines dying off during the cold frost freezing winters are an issue. So many will be covered with hay or other protections to get through that cold winter. The summers are very hot, and there's little rain during the growing season, and little wind as well. So a fairly disease pressure-free growing season. As you can see, the highs are quite high, and then the lows in the winter are below freezing. So in summary, long, warm, sunny days with little wind during the growing season means that grapes will ripen without the influence of fruit desiccation or dehydration. So very bright, pure, pristine fruit flavors are produced, and then the lack of summer rain really decreases disease pressure, so grapes can hang out there until they're perfectly ripe with little pressure to get them in, apart from fall frosts for the growers. This results in bright, bold, generous, fruit-driven wines with lovely resolved tannins that are capable of long cellaring and bright acid profiles. The Walla Walla Valley's main soil series is low Basalt Cobbles and Missoula floodwaters. So millions of years ago, when Oregon was on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, layers of marine sediment and bedrock generally were pasting themselves to the western area. This area was under Ice Age, and the main topsoils here in the Walla Walla Valley are focused around the Missoula flood slackwater sediment, which was produced when the Ice Age floods temporarily slowed and deposited a lot of suspended particle sediments. They do get quite clogged and claggy when there is rain, which is why with irrigation you are able to generally produce great wines here, because these will retain some clay-like character and get quite gluggy when you irrigate them. Basalt cobbles are formed from the Columbia River basalt rocks, which eroded from the Blue Mountains, the volcanic series there, and deposited them into an alluvial fan along the Walla Walla Valley and the Milton Freewater District. They're around 200 to 300 feet deep, so a very surface series of cobbles, which really assists the vines by warming them in the spring and really starting off that growing season. And then they radiate heat back to the vines during the evening, so the vines get a really protracted growing season, and the skin tannins can develop during the ripening that's occurring from the heat reflection as well. And then the low soils are these weathered windblown soils that are developed from glacial erosion of the granite bedrock. So very free draining. Again, these, when you add water to them, can get a clay like stickiness to them. So they're useful for irrigation, and you can control the vine stress in these soils. So all combining to make very complex, very ripe, concentrated styles of wines here in the Walla Walla Valley. Within the Walla Walla Valley, we have a new AVA known as the Rocks District of Milton Freewater. You can see in that image there the cobbles that we're talking about, which line the valley floor of the Walla Walla Valley, and specifically this Milton Freewater District. So this district is quite unique in that it is a soil series or cobble series that is named after these free-water series of rocks, and one of the most distinctive AVAs in the US, created recently. So only established in 2015. It's a small area that's planted to 230 acres, again, over that free-water series of basalt cobbles and gravels. So very important for the ripening of the generally red varieties that are planted here. The main varieties are Syrah, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Grenache. The vineyards are entirely on one landform, that alluvial fan produced by the Walla Walla River. No other AVA in the U.S. can claim one landform and one soil series, that being free water, as unique to its AVA. They're a large diurnal range in temperature, again preserves the acidity in these grapes, and the wines often have perfumed bouquets with a savory palate and prominent lingering minerality on the finish. Again, it comes down to how the winemaker, decides when to pick these grapes, and the amount of extraction and temperature fermentation in the in the cellar, as to how deep and dark and brooding and concentrated these wines can be. They can be as big as some of the more traditional styles coming out of the warmer areas in Napa and California and Bordeaux, and they can also be as elegant as some of the Rhone varieties, Grenache dominant wines that are coming out of the southern Rhone and some of the southern Italian areas.
We had a question that came in about the slide previously, in the previous Walla Walla slide. They're wondering what resolved tannins are. How would you describe that?
Oh, so resolved tannins are generally what you call perfectly ripe tannins, and so they lack the bite and astringency of tannins that require long aging in barrel or a lot of racking and oxidation. So allowing the tannins to ripen fully on the vine, and then you don't really need to do a lot of extraction on the tannins to preserve the wines, because the wines are completely developed on the vine there, and you can have those really plush, long chain tannin profiles on the palate, giving structure and elegance and a velvety woody character without being astringent and too mouth-puckeringly drying on the palate.
Oh, thanks.
So again, that's another picture of those cobbles in the Rocks district of Milton Freewater. The Columbia Gorge AVA is, as we leave Walla Walla and head west along the Columbia River towards the Pacific Ocean. This Hood River area was established in 2004. This area is traditionally an area that was planted to orchard fruits. And when you're in the Hood River Valley, AVAs, there's very much a shared farming space between cherries, pears, apples, and many of the producers in the Columbia Gorge don't stick to just making wine. They'll often make a cider as well, and there are even a couple that are doing a combination of making cider and wine together. So a lot of creativity in this relatively young area, although there have been vines planted here for quite a long time and have some very well-established vineyards. As we moved from the high desert of the Eastern Gorge, as we start to move towards the Pacific Ocean through the Dalles, the region becomes wetter and more Pacific influenced, with a lot more influence from the Pacific Ocean winds, which really help to cool down what can be quite a warm area. The river is wide, but the valley here tends to be reasonably steep, and so you have a lot of aspects for grape growing at the higher altitudes, and generally limited ability, if any, for machine harvesting of fruit here. The diversity of varieties is exciting and quite unique in this area as well. Pinot Noir is still the #1 variety, but the region grows everything from Arnais to Mencia to Zinfandel successfully. And that allows the wineries here to have a really protracted harvest cellar season, because they'll be bringing in grapes from the end of August or early September all the way through till the rains and snows come at the end of October. So that really allows them to have a lot of fun and experimentation in the cellar and create really unique wines in this area. Again, the precipitation in this area is much higher than in the Eastern Oregon area. So you can see it's not quite as high as it's going to be in the Willamette Valley or the northern Willamette Valley. This is a lot dominated by the winds and by the stacking of the mountain ranges that occurs as you move from the Pacific Ocean up into the Columbia River and into the Columbia Gorge. They're literally north-south valleys on the foothills of Mount Hood that really protect the gorge going inland from inclement weather patterns. The wind here in this area is very important for cooling the region during the growing season. It really protracts the growing season here, allowing for extended flavor development, pronounced acidities in the vines. A lot of the vineyards will be planted on sheltered aspects to protect from the fierce winds down this valley. They're very strong, wet maritime winds, and the Columbia Gorge area is actually one of the regions that is best known in the world for windsurfing and kiteboarding. So you can imagine with those types of winds, it's not entirely conducive for the vines, but it really does help to lessen the disease pressure in this maritime area and allows producers to be relatively hands-off in terms of their spraying throughout the region. The wind also contributes to smaller buried fruit, thicker skins, and a concentration of fruit in these wines. So long, warm, sunny days and cool nights during the growing season give nice, ripe and complex fruit flavors. The northerly latitude and the cooling influences from the Pacific Ocean really provide a protracted growing season, allowing for grape acid and flavor development to be in balance. Remember from that first regional temperature slide, the Columbia Gorge is a bit cooler than the Willamette Valley, simply because of that cool Pacific Ocean wind influence and the higher altitude of the sites here. They tend to be just a little higher than the traditional site in the Willamette Valley. These wines have really great aging potential, really bright fruit flavors, and are quite unique. The Columbia Gorge soils, so primarily volcanic soils here. So the basalt, which is produced in most of the Oregon soil series from volcanic eruptions. Basalt is produced when the lava flows come in contact with the surface of the earth and oxygen, and the lava is rapidly cooled by often either rain, wind, just the general climate there. So the Columbia River basalts were produced from the weathering of the Columbia River basalt bedrock. Much of it was scoured away in the Missoula floods, which were about 15 to 18 million years ago. The soil is very rich in iron and clay content, which often gives it a distinctive red hue, and there's generally fewer nutrients available than in the marine sediment soils. The Cascade Mountain stream sediments are from the weathering of the Cascade Mountain volcanic series, and they were deposited in the eastern part of the gorge, closer to the Dalles. So there's quite a diversity of volcanic soils within this very small region. The Underwood Mountain basalt was produced from the eruption of Underwood Mountain, and it's very low in nutrients, but it has quite big holes in the basalt, so it's quite good for drainage, and those holes can also absorb water throughout the growing season or earlier in the spring when we receive most of our winter and spring rainfall. That allows the vines to tap into those basalt water retentive soils. The Underwood Mountain soils are mostly in vineyards at high altitudes, and these soils can help to restrain the vine vigor, and you don't need the irrigation that you need in the eastern side on those soils. The lahars are mostly formed by intense rainfall during or after an eruption of lava. So the rainwater easily erodes loose volcanic rock and soil on the hillsides and the river valleys, and many of the largest lahars are usually landslides of saturated and hydrothermally altered rock that flanked volcanoes in the area. So Underwood Mountain, Mount Hood, this is a very volcano-rich area, and the soils here are really unique to this growing area. And it's a really beautiful backdrop as well when you're standing there tasting wine in the vineyard with all of these beautiful snow-capped mountains or volcanoes surrounding you. Again, we also have some loess and some fast and slack water deposits, which tend to be, again, more of that silty, fine soil series, free draining, but with rainfall or irrigation can help to retain and give a slow release of water to the vines. So main factors for the Columbia Gorge, transitional area between the maritime influence of the western end to the more continental of the eastern end. That means that between Mosier and more the classic Hood River region, you can really have a diversity of grape varieties. So Mencia, Tempranillo, these thicker-skinned grape varieties, and Cabernet Sauvignon being planted on the eastern end where it tends to be drier and warmer, and then a lot more Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and traditional Oregon varieties planted on the western end where you're really getting the influence of the cooling ocean and the drying winds in those areas for these delicate grape varieties. And that's basically a traditional vineyard view in the Columbia Gorge.
And before we move on, feel free to ask any questions about the gorge. We did have a question come in about Walla Walla that came in a little bit later. So are the Basalt Cobbles similar to the Galettes in Southern Rhone?
Yeah, they're very similar. They tend to be a little lighter almost, and so there's a few more air pockets in there, but they're very similar to those Gallet pudding stones that you see in the Rhone Valley. And so because of the reasonably shallow expanse of those pudding stones, they allow for a lot of free draining on the top of the soil. So in young vineyards, there may be some water stress because of the very free draining and warmth of those pudding stones. But as the vines roots go deeper and age develops, they hit the bedrock and can really access a different water table. And that's when it really becomes of benefit to the vineyards in those areas. Those pudding stones that sit on top, or cobbles as we call them, really like to keep in the moisture that's fallen over the winter in the form of snow, and then thaws during the spring, and really soaks deep into the earth. And those Gallet cobbles can really protect the soil from dehydration, as well as those upper cobbles warming up from the heat of the spring and that fierce sun in high desert conditions. Very humid, very humidity-free, dry continental climates in that high desert location, but very similar to the pudding stones in the Rhone.
Cool.
Good question.
Yeah, great question. So, Bree, I think we were ambitious to think we could get through all this in an hour.
Definitely.
So we're going to transition now into the Willamette Valley. We hope you stay with us. If you have to go somewhere, again, we're recording it, and we'll be sure to send you the recording for you to finish up later, but we still have a lot of really good stuff to talk about.
So breaking down now into the Willamette Valley, which is Oregon's most exported region and has the largest plantings in our state. So it's our largest plantings. 72% of the region is planted to Pinot Noir. And really, Oregon and the Willamette Valley are renowned nationally and internationally for the great Pinot Noirs that come out of this valley. No other grape is really as reflective of climate and site differences, and the fact that the producers here in the Willamette Valley have been working with small sites generally for their entirety and exploring the different aspects and slopes and distinctive soil types in the area and how that reflects in Pinot Noir has really created a great camaraderie in this valley and to our reputation as a world-class Pinot Noir region. So we're going to explore the nested AVAs and the characters that lead to the different flavors in Pinot Noir from these nested AVAs. So Pinot Noir being the main variety, Pinot Gris following that, and as I mentioned earlier, Chardonnay, which at the moment sits at around 7%, it's more likely that it's double that. There's a lot of Chardonnay that's about to come online in the next couple of vintages, so the vintage census reports will reflect that more accurately. Riesling, Pinot Blanc, Cheroub, Sylvana, other Gewürztraminer, Sauvignon Rose, other Alsatian varieties, aromatic varieties, and Jura varieties now are starting to take hold in the region. Riesling and Pinot Blanc have been here for a long time, and they really are part of the landscape, which also adds to a protracted cellar season here in the Willamette as well. The second red grape variety that we're finding a lot of excitement around is Gamay Noir, which is now being produced by, I believe, nearly 40 producers. Despite the Gamay Noir variety barely appearing on our tonnage report, it's actually starting to make a real impact in the local market here, and we're seeing more of it into the national markets as well. The Gamay Noir in the Willamette Valley tends to retain its acidity quite well and has a really racy structure to it, and reflects very differently from the nested AVAs from Ribbon Ridge through to the Eola Hills. It presents itself in a very distinctive manner in each of the nested AVAs. So like Pinot Noir, it's very site-specific and soil-specific and climate-specific in terms of its character profiles, and a lot of people are starting to get attention for that variety. So the Willamette Valley, the AVA was established in 1983. However, the first vineyards were planted by California transplants Charles Curry and David Lett in 1965, who really had the belief that fine quality wine would be grown here in this northerly climate that benefited from a cooler growing season, more rainfall during the winters, and more protracted growing season. This is a large AVA. It's 3.5 million acres, and we currently only have 22,000 acres planted. So there's a lot more plantings that can happen, although we are limited by the Coast Range and the Cascade Range foothills. The Coast Range in particular is very heavily forested, and as I mentioned earlier, the valley floor is not an area that's planted really to high quality grapes. The region is still very much a mixed agricultural area, and those valley floor fertile areas are still mostly planted to hazelnuts and grass seed and dairy. So combined with the logging that happens in the Cascade Ranges and Coast Ranges, there's still limited amounts of land available for planting, and it's expanding, but it's certainly not expanding in a hurry. Just to give you an idea of comparison purposes, Sonoma County covers around 1 million acres, and 60,000 of those are planted acres, and there's 1,800 grape growers on those 60,000 planted acres. So just in terms of density of production, you know, California is much bigger production than our growing region here. So a lot of room for expansion, but as we all know, vineyards take time to come online. And so we're now at a very special phase in the Willamette where we're getting a lot of vineyards that have really good vine age, and now a lot more plantings that are happening to mixed clonal diversity within the nested AVAs, and with a lot of intent and a lot of research behind them. So when we speak of the Willamette Valley, despite it spreading from just north of Portland to just south of Eugene, we're generally referring to the northern Willamette Valley when we talk about the AVAs within it. There's 6 nested AVAs with a couple more about to come online in the north here. The planting boundaries for these nested AVAs are again a nod to the quality-mindedness of the original producers who petitioned for these nested AVAs. They demanded that within these new AVAs that the planting boundaries be limited to a minimum 200 feet from sea level or from the valley floor, in order to prevent producers planting on the very fertile valley floor and possibly, you know, ruining the reputation of the quality of wines that were being produced in the area at the time and of these producers. So approximately 72% of the state's Pinot Noir comes from the 40-mile long region here. The hills just south of Salem up until almost Portland is where these AVAs spread. And really, these nested AVAs were only created in 2004. Many of them are based around soil types, and we'll get into that in a minute. But first, I'm going to touch on the key climate zones aspects that really influence the winemaking and planting in these areas. So the temperature and precipitation in the Willamette Valley, generally we experience damp, cool winters and fairly warm, dry summers, which are fairly typical of maritime climates. This northern latitude, combined with the proximity to the cool Pacific Ocean, brings moderate temperatures year-round with no pressure of vine killing in the cold winter or really serious frost in the spring. Again, most of our vineyards are planted on fairly well-sloped aspects, enough of a slope that it makes machine harvesting and even general pruning and tractor driving fairly dangerous in our wet springs and falls. So really a very hand-tended vineyard environment in our vineyards. The Cascade Mountains to the east provide protection from the hot and cold extremes of the continental interior, so really buffering us from that vacuum effect and the really hot desiccating winds that can come from eastern Oregon. Peak heat during the Willamette Valley's summer growing season is generally between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. and sunset occurs after 9 p.m. during the summer. So really 15 to 16 hours of daylight for these vines, which again really develops the fruit flavors and means that we have to be quite meticulous in our approach to vineyard viticulture measures. The mild winters, relatively cool summers contribute to the concentrated flavor development. Again, as I mentioned, that UV is as important to ripening as heat is. Depending on how much we leaf pull and open the canopies is really dependent on the season that we're having. We have very large shifts in our viticultural seasons. So our viticulturists need to be really in tune with the coming weather patterns and able to adapt swiftly if we need to be able to open the canopies for incoming rains or provide more shade and less sun for our vines. We receive quite a lot of rain in the year. It's around 44 inches per year. Compared to Burgundy, Burgundy receives 28. Burgundy's rainfall is often also over the entire growing season. It's not limited to the winter and spring, where the Willamette Valleys is very much limited to winter, fall and spring rainfall. And you can see during June, July, August, the precipitation is very, very low in these areas. So we have a very dry, almost drought-stricken summer in Oregon. And so when many of you come to Oregon Pinot Camp or visit the area, it's definitely the very beautiful time to visit it in the summer, but it doesn't give you a true sense of what our winemakers and growers are really going through, because there is quite a lot of cold and damp months that we spend here.
It's been raining for like 6 months straight right now. We're ready to see some sunshine.
It would be nice. So again, those dry summers limit the disease pressure, but again, it depends how much rainfall and humidity we have in the spring, and how vigilant we need to be in the vineyard in that springtime. Again, it allows for us to really ripen Pinot Noir to exactly the right parameters that we need it. In some years, that means picking at the end of August or middle of September, definitely for Chardonnay, but often for Pinot Noir as well, which is why Gamay Noir, with its slightly thicker skins and better acid retention, is also showing some promise in our hot vintages here. The day length we've already mentioned. It's relatively northern locale here, means that we get very extended daylight hours and UV exposure, which assists in the phenolic ripening of the grapes. So The tannins are developing and becoming soft and supple at the same time that the heat and light is creating the delicious fruit flavors in the wines. So in general, Beaune has a little more daylight hours than ours, but they're less fruit dominant and less alcoholic than many of the Pinot Noirs produced in the Willamette Valley, simply because of the protracted growing season and the heat of our summer, combined with that absence of rainfall. So in Beaune, you're generally finding that there's a lot more rainfall that's breaking up the ripening season there. And in Sonoma, they have the benefit of, or detriment depending on whether it's affecting the disease pressure, of a coastal fog influence that comes in the mornings and tends not to burn off until the middle of the day, so slowing that ripening season. So ours is a very short ripening season, which we need to moderate in the vineyard for how our grapes ripen. Wind in the Willamette, we tend to get hit from 3 different sides depending on which AVA you're in. So a lot of our wind influence comes from the Pacific Ocean. It's released through small gaps in the coast range. The major gap and wind pressure that we see blows down the Van Duzer corridor. It's a fairly large gap in the coast range, which really affects 2 major AVAs, specifically the western side of the Eola-Amity Hills and the southerly southeasterly parts of McMinnville, and just touches the south of the Dundee Hills. So just really moderating that summer heat. And when you're in the vineyard here or cellar during harvest, you can almost time your watch to these Van Duzer corridor winds starting up at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and a noticeable temperature drop which continues through the evening into a diurnal drop that can be quite severe, but not nearly as severe as what you find in Walla Walla or in the Umpqua Valley. So a nice cooling influence in the afternoon helps our grapes take a breather again during the evening, replenishing their reserves and acid retention, and being able to chill out from the heat of the hot summer days here. There's also obviously the Columbia River Gorge wind, which really only touches the western edge of the northern part of the Chehalem Mountains. The Chehalem Mountains also protect the Dundee Hills and Ribbon Ridge and Yamhill Carlton from some of the winds that come from the east during the summer as well, which can be quite hot winds coming down that gorge as well. The protection of some of these mountain ranges, the Chehalem Mountains and the Eola-Amity Hills, can really help to push the wind direction around certain vineyard areas and either offer protection or open up the area to more sustained cooling influences that the wind can bring. There's never really enough wind that the grapes are induced to desiccation or vine stress. We're not talking like Santorini type winds here, but it is noticeable in AVAs like Eola-Amity and McMinnville, where the grapes do tend to develop slightly thicker skins, and in part that's because of that complex wind system and consistent wind that happens. So generally, long, warm, sunny days and cool nights help to produce the complex fruit flavors, and then the northerly latitude cooling influences that come from our ocean influences really mean that the wines here have great acid retention, complex fruit flavors, and are really well-aged, good aging wines with those acid and fruit flavors and lower alcohols, and perfect for food pairing. Talking about the Willamette Valley soils, there are 3 distinctive soil types. We like to talk about soil and terroir when it's related to Pinot Noir specifically, a grape that shows great transparency of sight. But I believe that in the Willamette and our New World areas, we're really reliant as much on the vineyard placement and climate with the wind influences, the sun influences, and rain influences that are in conjunction with our soil series here. So the marine sedimentary soils, so three main soil series: marine sediments, volcanic basalt, and then wind-blown loess. The marine sedimentary soils are uplifted from the ancient seabed and consist of eroded sandstone and siltstone. The marine sedimentary soils tend to have less water holding capacity than the volcanic soils. Dry-grown vineyards that are on these soils mean that the roots are forced to drive very deep to scavenge for pockets of water and minerals. The marine sediment soils tend to be low in pH with less available nitrogen in the soil. So managing the vineyard canopy in terms of, intersowing of cover crop in the vineyards for nitrogen fixing and nutrient development is a priority in these vineyards. Generally, these vineyards can get quite a lot of, because of our rainfall, they can be quite acidic soils and create wines with quite high pH. So that's something that we need to manage in the winery as well. The main marine sediment soils, primarily the one that is most famous is Willackenzie, being based in the Ribbon Ridge area, but Melbourne, Gooden, Wellsdale, Belpine, and the Dupee soil series are also predominant marine sedimentary soils of importance. The three main AVAs, nested AVAs of the Willamette that are dominant with marine sedimentary soils are Ribbon Ridge primarily and Yam Hill Carlton, and then Chehalem Mountains has also a lot of marine sediments, but it's a very fractured and diverse AVA, so there's a lot of mixed soils in the Chehalem Mountains because of the uprising in that mountain range. The volcanic basalts. So as I mentioned earlier, basalt is volcanic stone that's formed at or near the surface with exposure to oxygen, as opposed to granite, which is volcanic stone that's formed under the surface without exposure to oxygen, and so it's much harder. Because of the friable nature of the basalt, the roots can really explore their way through it. And generally, its surface exposure means that there's a fairly thin amount of topsoil, usually in the AVAs that are dominant in the basalts. Fractured basalt soils, high in iron, can be found in three major wine-growing states on the U.S. West Coast. The basalt easily cracks and breaks down and also turns red when it's exposed to oxygen. So that's the Jory soils that you see in the Dundee Hills, which are often known as the Red Hills of Dundee because of that iron-rich exposure of the clay and basalt. As these basalts crack, they can absorb water a little better than the marine sediments and retain that during the growing season, which is really important in an area like the Willamette Valley, where the majority of our vineyards are dry grown and planted without irrigation. So these are very important soils for our hot summers that we can have here. Wines from iron-rich basalts tend to be more uplifted on the palate. They can have a ferrous or gunflint, sanguine, bloody note to the structure and flavor profile, and also a lovely perfumed floral prettiness as well. The Nakaya soil series tends to be found further south in the McMinnville and Eola Amity Hills AVAs as opposed to the Jories. The windblown loess also includes Laurelwood soil series. These are the youngest soils of the area. They're quite gritty and very textural particles. Over time, they become weathered and can form really small little shot pebbles. And then when these soils get wet, they can act like that wet clay and stick together, even though they contain no clay. So they're actually very free draining soils, which can result in younger vines with less established root systems being easily stressed through some of our hot, dry summers. So if you have a vineyard that's on these predominant windblown loess soils, you will generally set up irrigation or be able to find a way to irrigate your vines during hot summers. They're highly fertile soils which create wines that tend towards very floral aromatics. They can have slightly austere or rustic tannins, and they have plenty of natural acidity because of the higher pH of these soils. Willamette Valley overview. So generally, we are starting to speak about the Willamette Valley as being a series of nested AVAs or greater AVA with very complex fruit flavors, a complex soil system, and a lot of diversity in our sites and specificity for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. The complex soils of this cool climate generally result in very bright, pure expressions of Pinot Noir. Again, depending on the vintage, we have extreme vintage variation, and so paying attention to the growing season is important. So we're going to move quickly through the nested AVAs of the Northern Willamette Valley. So currently 6 nested AVAs, the Chehalem Mountains AVA being the northerlymost AVA that is located around 40 minutes south of Portland, primarily marine sediment soils with volcanic loess, or known as laurelwood soils, which will be the next AVA to be released within within these AVAs as well. There's a lot of varieties grown in the Chehalem Hills because of the varied aspects. You can see that ridge that sits above Ribbon Ridge there, which really buffers from the gorge winds, but you can also see the gap that's to the north of Ribbon Ridge that allows the Pacific Ocean wind influence through there, cooling those vineyards on the southwesterly sides of Chehalem Mountains and Ribbon Ridge. So Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, Riesling, Pinot Blanc, Gamay Noir, Gruner Veltliner, Trousseau Noir. There's a little bit of everything planted in Chehalem, and it's a really exciting AVA to watch going forward. It's defined by that distinctive ridge. Their vineyard plantings are from 200 feet elevation all the way up to 1,000 feet elevation. On the Parrot Mountain end, which is the most easterly end that sits on the easterly side of the Highway 99, the vineyards here are very protected in terms of surrounded by forests and very high altitude. So they can be very cool climate characters, and this is where a lot of sparkling wine is grown, specifically for sparkling wine production. So varied elevations combined with a diversity of soils and aspects in the Chehalem AVA really offer a wide flavor spectrum for Pinot Noir and other varieties that are produced, characterized by wines with precise, defined red fruit flavors and really bright acidity in cool years. Think more of, that cranberry, pomegranate character. And then in warmer vintage, the wines can really quickly build muscle and develop darker red-blue wild forest fruits with lots of spice and plush tannin profile.
And the Chehalem Mountains looks like an upside-down T-Rex.
It does look like an upside-down T-Rex. I love that.
It's often talked about, and it's an easy way to remember which one the Chehalem Mountains is.
Right. What's that yoga pose?
Handstand.
Yeah.
His hands are too short.
Headstand. So these are some of the new soil maps that we have that are created by Chad Vargas from New Gen Vineyard Services. So these really clearly define our soil series and the era in which they were created. So you can see that the very northern slopes of the Chehalem Mountains is very much dominated by the loess soil series, and the Laurelwood AVA is currently being approved by the TTB at the moment. So these will become more complex nested AVAs as the region really develops. You can see that Parrot Mountain is a lot more basaltic, volcanic soils, and then the nested AVA of Ribbon Ridge is really primarily a sedimentary Willackenzie soil series. And this is a beautiful image at Elk Cove and shows one of our vineyard workers. As you can see, harvest here, it's a fairly lovely morning, and they're working hard picking grapes to fill all of those bins. So it's a very swift harvest here. Everything ripens at the same time because we're so reliant on that one variety, Pinot Noir. So our pickers during harvest are probably the hardest working people in the entire place, and they are picking day and night these days to maintain fruit integrity and just to get around all of the vineyards. So our pickers are really our unsung heroes during harvest, and I just love this photo because of that. So the Willamette Valley's Ribbon Ridge, created in 2005. It's a small AVA, 3,500 acres. With only 650 of that planted. It's marine sediment, Willamette series. Again, the predominant varieties are Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, and some Gamay Noir now appearing in a number of areas. It rises about 685 feet from the valley floor, which gives it an island-like appearance as you're driving through the valley area. It's unique as an AVA in the Willamette Valley because it is comprised majorly of one soil series, the Willamette series. These soils have little water holding capacity, except in the very low drainage areas. They're also fairly low in nutrients, which also helps to contribute to the lower vine vigor in these sites. And the AVA tends to be tucked into the sheltered west-facing ridge of the Chehalem Mountains. So it means that that bald peak, which sits just behind it, really protects it, but also pushes the wind that comes through from the gap between the Yamhill-Carlton AVA and the end of the Chehalem Mountains AVA. It pushes it into that northerly area and the upper elevations of vineyards here. Most of the vineyards are planted at mid-slope and move up onto the top of the slope, which has been really beneficial during our hotter vintages to have some of those more exposed to the coastal influence vineyards. Again, the red varieties planted here primarily Pinot Noir and increasingly Gamay, and the free draining soils in this area tend to result in quite opulent, spicy, perfumed reds with really lovely floral notes that range from rosehip to pomegranate to potpourri, depending on the heat of the vintage, and often have a spicy blood orange or citrus candied peel character depending on the vintage warmth as well. Because of the free draining soils and the warmth of this AVA, Riesling also performs very well here, which is a later ripening style, and it's picked and made into a variety of styles here with from very dry, steely or steer Riesling through to quite floral Rieslings with Granny Smith apple characters and some residual sugar notes. Pinot Gris tend to have more spice notes and ginger beeswax characters, as do the Chardonnays in this area. There's a general spice note that comes through on all of these wines in the Ribbon Ridge AVA. Again, that's the sedimentary soil series. And you can see the vineyards are definitely interspersed between other paddocks, other agricultural crops, and we have a lot of forest surrounding our vineyards as well. Dundee Hills, probably the most well-known of the AVAs or original AVAs that were founded internationally. The Red Hills of Dundee is famed for the oxidizing volcanic red joy basalts, which provides excellent drainage and also warmth to the vines. Slightly warmer than other AVAs due to its east and west directed slopes. Those on the easterly exposure receive early morning warming sun, resulting in low disease pressure and very ripe, healthy fruit that can have a protracted and extended hang time. The AVA itself is nestled between the Coast Range and is buffered by the Chehalem Mountains. So the vineyards that are on the Dundee Hills tend to be protected from the cool Pacific Ocean breezes, giving just, the perfect warmth environment for growing grapes. The sheltered climate combined with the complex strawy soil produces Pinot Noir that tends to have more of a deep red cherry cola flavor, perfumed florals, and earthy truffle notes, especially in the cool vintages when you can really feel the presence and power of those volcanic soils. The most distinctive character of Dundee Hills Pinot Noir we often talk about is the inescapable mid-palate silkiness that really gives elegance and length to a lot of these wines and has a lot of lift and perfume despite any vintage conditions. McMinnville, this AVA is moving south. It's quite a large AVA, but only has 750 acres planted, so similar to in planted acreage to Ribbon Ridge. It's a variety of a mix of soils here, marine sediment, marine bedrock, and volcanic soils. And the grape varieties planted are diverse, and there's a lot of different aspects that are available to be planted in McMinnville, which allows for quite different fruit expression and site expression, depending on which of the valleys your vineyards are located in. I find McMinnville to be one of the most distinctive AVAs, and I find it a little underrepresented in the way that we speak about nested AVAs. It's planted primarily to Pinot Noir. Generally, the vineyards have a very thin topsoil, which is on top of a unique marine bedrock called the Nestucca Formation. So this lack of topsoil really forces the vine roots deep into the earth and into those volcanic soils in search of water and nutrients. It really causes the vines to struggle and really develops complex, brooding, powerful wines. And I find the power of the fruit in McMinnville to be the most distinctive character of this AVA. It's an AVA that needs time in bottle and needs to be thoughtfully handled in the cellar as well. I find it to be one of the most exciting AVAs, but I think it's just understanding the nature of these nested AVAs and where they all develop. It does also cop the brunt of some of the Van-Duzer corridor winds, especially on the southerly sector, which is a little more sedimentary soils. So those sedimentary soils, which are very free draining, combined with the pressure of the Van-Duzer corridor winds, creates grapes with quite small berries and fairly thick, intense skins. In very hot years and very windy years, these can be quite desiccated or very, very small and have very little, juice to skin ratio in terms of the pressure that's given from that wind element. Because of the thin topsoil, the vine's natural struggle, and the intensity of the Van-Duzer corridor winds in McMinnville, they tend to have quite complex, strong backbone of tannins and dark fruits, really minerally crushed rock and spice notes in the wines. These are very age-worthy wines, but they can be a little challenging in their use, but they really do reward time in bottle. And you see some of that exposure in the Momtazi vineyard, which is biodynamically farmed, but a very unique AVA. And then Yamhill Carlton, again established in 2004, quite a large AVA, but again, a lot of unplanted areas. A lot of unplanted areas and a lot of aspects that you can really craft to reflect either the site, the sheltering from the Pacific Ocean, or sheltering from the heat and the winds. As you can see, the AVA looks like a horseshoe, so it's quite sheltered. It's surrounded on three sides by the Coast Range, the Chehalem Mountains, and the Dundee Hills. The resulting areas are quite warm, sheltered sites, and it's the warmest growing season temperatures of the nested AVAs. It's comprised mainly of fairly coarse sedimentary soils, very free draining, so water stress can be a problem, and it has some of the earliest harvest dates within the northern Willamette Valley. The warmer mesoclimates within the Yamhill Carlton area do result in quite ripe, full-bodied, and often deeply extracted wines because of the alcohol load or sugar load. The tannins, the color and tannins can be extracted quite easily because of that opulent fruit presence. But they're really lovely texturally driven wines with a lot of blue fruit and pastels, purple floral and cola notes layered with earth and chocolate spice flavors. Again, capable of very long aging, these wines, with that concentration presence being a key factor to that ageability. These wines are also some of the most heavily oaked in the area, again to soften some of that fruit and tannin presence in the wines. The Willamette Hills, so we're in the most southerly nested AVA now. This AVA was created in 2006. It's 39,000 acres, 3,000 of which is planted. And again, this is a complex series of soils as well, which you'll see from the next slide. You have the sedimentary soils on the western side and primarily Nakaya and Jory volcanic basalt on the eastern side. Again, the prominent varieties are Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Riesling, and Gamay Noir, and also some Aligote being planted by the Burgundian fans down in this neck of the woods. The AVA is defined by the Van Duzer corridor, which really hits that western side of the AVA, producing quite small, thick-skinned berries with good acid retention and fairly high skin-to-juice ratio, giving really structured, savory wines. There's a distinctive coastal umami influence that I always find present in the Willamette Hills wines, Pinot Noir specifically. Tends to be a tea leaf or seaweed iodine, sort of savory tannin profile and flavor. It's volcanic Nakaya and Jory soils, so a combination of those darker Nakaya basalts and the more oxidized reds. The wines in this area from those basalt soils tend to be high-toned, quite lifted red spice fruits, and that cooling ocean influence really does give the wine sort of a dark, edgy, iodine character or personality to them. Definitely increased acid and tannin in these wines, so it's quite important to manage those tannins in the cellar. And the wines really do benefit from time in bottle. They have a lot of structure and a lot of complexity, and it's an area to watch. Evening Land, Seven Springs Vineyard. Questions about the Willamette before we move into Southern Oregon?
Oh, nothing's coming.
Okay.
I think when I'm going to edit this recording down into a few different parts so we can kind of break it up and you can share it a little bit easier with your staff. It is a little bit longer than we expected, but it's all really great information. So thanks for hanging in there, guys.
So Southern Oregon, the AVA for Southern Oregon was established in 2005. There's 5 AVAs within Southern Oregon.
Oh, we just have a question. Oops. Before we move on to Southern Oregon, there's been a rumor about the Van Duzer AVA. Do you know when it's going to be approved or what the state of that is?
I believe the latest update we had was that it's past all of the objection phases with the TTB. So I imagine whenever they have enough staffing or funding to return to that, it will be coming out very soon. So it looks like it's a distinctive enough AVA and has been approved by all who submitted and without any objections. And the TTB have found no objections with it as well. So it will be the next AVA, I believe, to be released along with Laurel.
Right around the McMinnville AVA?
It's a little, yeah, just a little southwest of the McMinnville AVA.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, that was the only question.
So Southern Oregon, the region is really defined by its 4 rivers and 3 major mountain ranges. The Southern Oregon region has a huge diversity of vineyard aspects, elevations, and soils, and it produces a really wide range of increasingly outstanding wines and really exciting varieties being planted here. There's a real curiosity and excitement to the industry in Southern Oregon at the moment. So Southern Oregon as an AVA actually comprises 2 quite large nested AVAs, which we tend to refer to now as individual AVAs in their own right. So sort of eschewing the Southern Oregon AVA and now referring primarily to the 2 major AVAs within the Southern Oregon area. So Umpqua Valley and Rogue Valley, which you see there. So they're all of the 5 nested AVAs of the Southern Oregon AVA. Elkton and Applegate, Red Hill and Elkton being smaller nested AVAs within the greater Umpqua Valley AVA, and Applegate has the smaller Rogue Valley AVA. So Southern Oregon vineyard plantings, second largest wine growing region, accounts for 22% of the state's total planted vineyards. Due to diverse geology and the varied climates and variety of mountain and river influenced aspects, many varieties perform well in Southern Oregon, and the exploration is continuing frequently, with Pinot Noir still being the dominant stakeholder in the vineyards, and Pinot Gris following that, but Syrah, Tempranillo, Merlot, Malbec, Chardonnay, Riesling, and many others are starting to take hold, like Albarino, Mourvedre, Sangiovese, Barbera, Tannat, are all starting to make really lovely, interesting wines from the Southern Oregon nested appellations. So as you can see, there's a beautiful image of the Siskiyou Mountains, so very complex. Again, most of the vineyards here are planted on the flatter areas because the coastal mountains are so prominent. There's really not a lot of land that can be planted going up into the higher elevations within the mountains. The Southern Oregon climate, it's quite a bit warmer than the Willamette Valley in the north, with quite higher temperatures, so regularly hitting into the early 100s and 90s in Southern Oregon. What really helps the region here during the growing season is the fact that the diurnal temperature swing is massive. It's one of the largest diurnal swings in the world, often dropping from 110 degrees during the day down to 40 or 50 degrees at night. So that large shift really helps replenish the vines and wake them back up from being shut down for so long during that heat, during the photosynthesis period during the day. So long, warm, sunny days, cool nights really help a lot of varieties with thick skins ripen and produce ripe and complex fruit flavors. You're really only limited by the creativity of the wine grower and the winemaker in these areas. There's so much diversity in the river system, in the vineyards that are surrounded by river systems and major mountain ranges. The airflows that come off of those mountain ranges and rivers really help to cool the vineyards and make sure that the air keeps moving through the grapes, making sure that they're low in disease and always lovely and ripe. Very food friendly, lots of aging potential with developed tannins. The geology and soils of Southern Oregon, so primarily marine sedimentary bedrock, where Oregon used to be underwater before the subduction zone, the tectonic plate shifted. There's still a lot of marine sedimentary bedrock in the Southern Oregon vineyards. There's also the volcanic series of the Cascade Mountain sediments and the Silesia terrain and the stream sediments. So the marine sediment was produced from the ocean islands and pieces of the ocean floor that were stuck onto the west coast as the tectonic plates subducted. These have higher clay content than marine sedimentary soil, so it has better water retention capabilities than the marine sediments of the north, and it really helps the vines dig deep into establishing quite a complex root system that has access to water throughout the growing season. The volcanic soils, Cascade Mountain sediments are produced from the weathering of the volcanic soil from the eruption of the Cascade Mountains. The soil has a dominant clay profile that also helps to retain water and helps the vines really resist stress in the heat of the growing season, which is definitely optimal in this much warmer growing area. We're not too far from the California border here, so it's quite a bit warmer than the northern Willamette Valley and the gorge areas. The Silesia terrain is quite a unique soil series to the southern Oregon area, and a lot of it is found in the Applegate Valley. This is actually basalt that's been formed underwater, so more like granitic, and has been uplifted due to the plate subduction. It's also fairly high in clay content and has lower nutrients than the marine sedimentary soil, so good for water retention, but you do need to watch your cover crops in these areas as well to help build in those nutrients into the soils for the vines. The stream sediments, as you can imagine, are composed of a lot of silt and sand and gravel, and are formed by the velocity of the former stream that was there. So the faster moving water generally leaves behind the larger sediments like gravels. This soil drains very quickly, and you find alluvial gravel beds and fans in certain aspects of the Applegate River Valley and some of the other Rogue Valley areas. The Southern Oregon overview. The junction of the three major mountain ranges, the Siskiyous, the Coast Range, and the Cascade Mountains, results in the highest elevation vineyards in Oregon. This helps produce more balanced, precise, bright-fruited wines, and this is where a lot of the Pinot Noir and Chardonnay is found in these southern areas. So we're capable of producing a complex variety of wines depending on where in the valley and in the slope that you're planting to. Again, the valley has one of the widest diurnal temperature shifts in the world, which helps preserve the acidity and the complexity in an otherwise warm region, and allows for more interesting grape varieties like Tempranillo that is used to that diurnal temperature shift in Spain, being a key to its tannin and flavor development. The Umpqua, Applegate, Illinois, and Rogue rivers also provide cooling influences and air movement, and the rivers are key factors in the creation of the wine-growing soils and where the vineyards are planted now. Obviously, a lot of these vineyards in southern Oregon would not survive without irrigation, so those river systems are important for irrigation to these vineyards as well. So starting in the north with the Umpqua Valley, there's about 150 microclimates south of Eugene. So very, very complex valley areas and different aspects of slope here. A lot of varieties are planted because of those unique microclimates. So everything from Chardonnay, Cabernet Franc, Sauvignon Blanc can really thrive in the Umpqua Valley, and along with Iberian varieties like Tempranillo, Malbec, Mourvedre, Albarino, and of course Pinot Noir is really held in high regard from the cooler, higher altitude AVAs in Elkton and in the southern Rogue Valley as well. So the convergence of the Cascade and Coast Mountain ranges and the Umpqua River creates a number of mesoclimates in the Umpqua Valley. The growing season temperatures here vary dramatically, depending on the elevation at which your vineyard is planted and the proximity to the ocean. The Umpqua Valley has one of the highest diurnal temperature swings known to any wine region, with daytime growing season temperatures often well into the upper 90s and exceeding 100 and 115 last year, but dropping to the mid-40s overnight. So this has led to a culture of experimentation and curiosity, with many varieties not commonly found elsewhere in the U.S. being established in this region first. Earl Jones of Abasala Vineyards was one of the important benefactors of these grape varieties, really investing in research and planting a number, more than 30 different grape varieties at his Abasala Vineyards in the Umpqua Valley. Tempranillo, Garnacha, Albariño, Malbec, Tannat, Tinta Roriche, Touriga Nacional, all of the Douro varieties, and also a number of their varied clones to see which would work in the Oregon wine regions, have all been thanks to Earl and his research. So the combination of all of these Iberian clones for Tempranillo has resulted in really lovely complex wines being produced from these varieties in the Umpqua Valley. The Umpqua Valley also has two nested AVAs, Alpton and the Red Hills, Douglas County. That's the Abasala Fault Line Vineyard. So literally when you're walking through this vineyard, it's the fault line is actually just to the left a little. You can walk across the fault line of the subduction zone, and it's quite a remarkable site to be in. And this is one of the vineyards that has one of the highest diurnal temperatures, but also the hottest during the day as well. So Elkton was established in 2013. It's planted to 305 acres, primarily clay loam. And because this is a more lateral valley, which is built along the Umpqua River, the growing region is quite a bit cooler than other sites in the Umpqua Valley. So this, the vineyards follow the snaky Umpqua River and are planted at varying altitudes or elevations along that river valley. It benefits from the wind of the Pacific Ocean, which is why it's really suited to more northern Willamette style wines and grape varieties. The acid retention is severe here. It's really pronounced and helps to keep the purity of the fruit in these wines, especially the Pinot Noir, which has those bright red fruit flavors and lovely spice, citrus characters, along with Gewürztraminer, Riesling, Pinot Blanc, and the Alsatian varieties, which make a really high floral content and pure fruit characters coming into these Alsatian varieties. They're generally made as varietal blends, but some are creating field blends with them as well. The Gewürztraminer tends to be very perfumed, but without the soapy, waxy fattiness of traditional Gewürztraminers, or how Torrontés and Gewürztraminer can often look in the New World. Southern Oregon's Rogue Valley. So the Rogue River Valley, as you can see here, this is a vineyard that sits on the Applegate River, and you can see the Siskiyous in the background there. Very misty, foggy during the growing season as well, to help protect the vineyard from the heat of the day. The Rogue Valley is one of the older AVAs. It was established in 1991, so it's older than the AVAs in the north, and is quite a complex AVA with the Applegate Valley AVA sitting within it. So it's primarily stream sediment soils, and then the varieties grown are mostly Bordeaux varieties and Rhone varieties, and also a lot of Pinot Noir, again at the more sheltered, shaded, cooler sites. So defined by the soils created by the Rogue River and its tributaries, the Illinois, Applegate, and Bear Creek rivers, the soils are very well-drained alluvial sediments and basalts, granites, that create free-draining soils and have many varied aspects and alluvial benches for a variety of grapes to thrive. The Rhone and Iberian varieties do particularly well on those alluvial benchlands, particularly along the Applegate River. So Grenache, Syrah, Tempranillo, even some Italian varieties, Barbera, Sangiovese, Vermentino, are performing quite well in these warmer alluvial valleys. The Pinot Noir and Chardonnay tend to be focused more around the town of Ashland and to the north of Medford, so into the foothills of the Siskiyous and Cascade Ranges. And those Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays that are planted at higher elevations here benefit from the ripeness of the warmth of the southern region and the extended daytime temperatures, but they also are important. The elevation is important to retain the acidity and the freshness in the wines. So they tend to be slightly plumper, rounder, darker fruited flavors than the Pinot Noirs produced in the northern part of the state, but have equally refreshing acidity and capable of good aging as well. Applegate Valley, along the Applegate River, established in 2000, there's 640 planted acres. Stream sediments are dominant in this area, and it's mostly Rhone varieties, Bordeaux varieties, and also a little bit of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, but primarily it's the Rhones that really thrive in this area. Again, the diurnal shift really helps to promote the rotundone and purple florals and spice characters in some of these Rhone varieties like Grenache and Syrah. And the extended daylight hours really help to ripen the Viognier, Roussanne, and Marsanne that are found in these areas as well. There tends to be lower disease pressure. The Applegate River keeps the airflow moving quite well, so there's limited frost, although many do have frost fans, and the free draining of the soil helps to create ripeness and fuller-bodied styles from these wines. Environmental stewardship, so 47% of Oregon vineyards are certified sustainable, a higher percentage than any other state in the U.S. And as mentioned earlier, Oregon accounts for 35% of total U.S. Demeter biodynamic vineyards, while producing only 1% of the total U.S. wine production, which is a pretty impressive statistic. We also have a high number of B Corp businesses. 14 certified wineries are certified B Corp, and 5 of them are here in Oregon. So we have a lot of sustainable-minded producers and very forward-thinking producers that are protecting not only our environment but helping to develop those in our industry that are important and continue to retain good people in our industry. Commitment to quality, the attention and care given by Oregon's grape growers has really been reflected in the consistency of the high-scoring wines that we receive from national publications. So 20% of Oregon's share of Wine Spectator points in the high 90s or in the 90s are despite our 1% of domestic production. So we account for 20% of the Wine Spectator scores despite such small production. So that's definitely a good reason to fill your lists and shelves with Oregon wines. And Eric Asimov was here for IPNC last year, and he walked away saying that he doesn't feel like there's anywhere else in the U.S. right now where the perspectives are so curious, diverse, and experimentation so fierce as it is in Oregon, and thinks it's the highest quality level seen across the U.S. at the moment. Growing consumer demand for Oregon wine. So small production wines made from hand-picked fruit, really winning praise among consumers as well. Again, along with our commitment to environmental standards, and quality standards through our purity laws and increased AVA production and AVA purity laws. That's been reflected in the retail volume growth of Oregon wine nationally in the marketplace. And if you would like to put your own PowerPoint together for education purposes for your team in the restaurant or in your distribution team, please come to our Oregon Wine Board Resource Studio. If you click through to the trade segment, you'll find the Resource Studio and detailed instructions on how to use it, how to compile your own PowerPoint, and there's also finished templates and slides of quick industry statistics or our environmental stewardship and other little tidbits on there. Lots of maps, lots of soil maps.
Now,
and
believe it or not, even after 2 hours, we still didn't touch everything about Oregon wine. So there's a ton you can learn on there. Someone just came in with a question. They miss the Snake River AVA? Did we not touch on it? We just didn't have time today, but there is a full presentation on the Resource Studio about Snake River, so you can learn a little bit more about that there. So thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Bree. That was really comprehensive and amazing. Again, I'll be following up with the presentation and the recording. So if you did have to miss, if you had to step away for a little bit, you can catch up on that. And please respond to the email that I send if you have any questions about how to get set with Oregon Wine Month and how to participate in that. So thank you everybody, and we hope that you're as excited about Oregon wine as we are. So have a great day. Bye.